Hey, welcome to our uh, webinar on House Bill 4401, what every landlord needs to know. I want to start with an introduction. I know this is the first time that some of you are seeing me, so we want to jump right in. I'm Martine Tamick. I'm a residential real estate broker here in the state of Oregon. I've been a realtor since 2013. Prior to that, I actually was a property manager in the Portland metro area for about 8 years, managed large complexes. It's been a while since I've been a property manager. And I also was an executive assistant in a commercial brokerage. I have a real estate finance degree, and I live in Southwest Portland with my husband and my cute dog, Cody. Okay, so let's get into this. So today we're going to be talking about the single family housing market, as well as the nuts and bolts of why you're here with House Bill 4401 and the update on the eviction moratorium, landlord compensation fund, and then we're going to come back in and talk about overcoming challenges to selling tenant-occupied properties in 2021, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and answers during the webinar. Please feel free to ask questions live, and you want to go to the questions box instead of the chat. We won't be able to see the chat, so hopefully we'll be able to get those and answer them while they're coming in. Okay, so let's jump into the market overview. So in this slide, what you can see is that the US total home sales are at the highest levels that we've seen since 2006, 7, and 8, when we had an amazing market, and then we went into the crash. So contrary to what many would have expected in this pandemic, home sales, both units and sales volume, are booming in today's market. Now, why is that? Well, it has to do with prices and demand going up, and primarily those are due to stimulus, increased in savings, because none of us are traveling anymore, record low inventory, and interest rates. And we'll talk about the inventory a little bit more. So here we have inventory, and we're going over the US market right now. We're doing a national look, and then we'll pop into a more local and micro look at our current market. But since the Great Depression or Great Recession, we've seen a reduction in new home starts. And what that means is over the last decade, we have missed out on about 10 million homes being built. And in 2008, that you can see from the slides, we had a surplus of homes going into that Great Recession, and that quickly turned into a shortage of homes as home builders were, you know, they really took a hit and weren't incentivized really to continue building, and honestly, a lot of them got shut down. So we didn't see builders come back the way we would have wanted them to come back. And that's led to a shortage of homes over the last decade in general. However, with lockdowns and restrictions and the lockdowns and restrictions due to the COVID response, the supply of new homes has even been more critically affected in the last 12 months. And that's what you can see here on these slides. So if you look at the second slide with just the blue lines, we're looking at inventory in months. And that line, that yellow line, is our 6-month average. And that's what the National Association of Realtors says is a balanced market. In today's market, we feel like more of a 4 months is a balanced market, but you understand where I'm going with this. And as we had that surplus of 10 months of inventory in 2008, you can see how it trickled down as it became more of a buyer's market, and they're eating up that inventory. And then as that inventory is eating up, you can see by 2021, we are at the lowest inventory nationally that we have seen in a really long time, or historically. So we want to move from inventory into mortgage rates, because that plays a huge part in what we're seeing today. So why are mortgage rates important? Well, they affect the price we pay. We don't buy the price, we buy the payments. And in general, that when interest rates go down, we see housing prices go up. So what have we seen over the last decade? Well, as you can see in these, in the top slide on mortgage rates, and this of course is again national, you see that we have been staying between about 3.5 and 5% over the last decade. So kind of a minimal move up and down. And as we moved into 2020 and COVID hit, we saw a decrease in interest rates to about 2.7. I saw, just anecdotally, I saw a couple of my buyers go into the 2.3 and 2.5 range, but nationally, you know, we hit right around 3% on average for the month, for the year of 2020. And right now we are seeing interest rates increase, but that being said, they're still at historic lows, making the affordability of these homes much more appealing for people to get in. That's coupled with them saving extra money and the low new home starts. Okay, let's move on to the Portland metro area. So just like the United States or the nation, we are also experiencing all the same things there. And then Portland has a few other things going on with it, right? We have our urban growth boundary, which also limits us from building more inventory. Builders haven't been as incentivized to build, just, you know, a lot of them got out of the business and then coming back in, they just really haven't had that incentive. Contrary to what most people believe with COVID happening, and I know Portland has had a lot of issues, and we have the homeless population that's also creating a lot of what most people think is an exodus from the urban areas. But the influx of migration into Portland is eating up any of the exodus or new inventory that we've had due to any of those issues. So if you were to have purchased a home a year ago, it would have been on average, or if you buy a house, like bought a house today, on average, we're seeing that prices went up about $72,000. And just to kind of outline what we just went over with the nation, we have 1.9 months of inventory nationally on average. Today, we have 1 month of inventory. So Portland itself is really feeling that influx of prices going up due to high demand and some of the other things we just talked about. Okay. So I know there's a lot of numbers on this page, but I just wanted to kind of show you what this looks like via the numbers over the last 3 years, or well, last couple years, and then month over month. So if we look at this graph up here where we're talking about inventory, and I outlined here that in today's market, we really consider 4 months of inventory being a more balanced market. People get information a lot faster now. So we're really seeing that change, that National Association of Realtors number from 6 months to about 4. And this is what all my colleagues, we talk about this quite a bit. So when we're looking at these numbers up here in inventory, you can see in 2019, we really hovered between 2 and 3 months of inventory. But as we get into 2020, you see this area where we really had a strong market going in for sellers, really tough for buyers. But then we see the lockdown, and that happened in March. And I think that in April and May, you saw that the inventory pop up a little bit, only because we were really trying to figure out what do we do? You know, everybody was staying in place. We didn't really know how to sell real estate in that environment. So I think that that popped up inventory. So there's more people, that there wasn't enough people absorbing or buying those houses. And then as we move into June, what we see is a dramatic drop in the inventory. And throughout the rest of the year, it continues to go lower and lower and lower. And that's just migration, low interest rates. We're hitting those under 3%. And in December of 2020, in Portland's recorded history, Portland Metro's recorded history, we saw that inventory drop to under 1 month, which is really makes it a very competitive market if you're a buyer. Then if you take a look at the second set of stats, really what I want you to pay attention to is this, the lower numbers here under year to date. And what that really it is outlining for you guys, and it's just really trying to bring it home that inventory is extremely low. So new listings coming on the market year to date compared to year to date last year is down 8.1%. If you go over to the next box under closed sales, under that year to date at the very bottom, we're seeing 7% increase in the absorption rate. So we have less listings, more absorption, and that really pushes our prices up. So year over year, on average, we saw about 15%, and that is going to be that $72,000 more that sellers saw from last year to this year. Okay, so that really wraps up our, let me go to the next slide, sorry. So I just want to wrap up for you guys. Inventory is down due to COVID and the lack of new supply. People are just changing the way they live. Prices are up due to low interest rates, stimulus checks going out. People have been able to increase their savings, and we just have a real tight supply. And locally, how that affects us is, year to date, we've seen about a 15% increase. What I can say anecdotally is in the last 2 months, I think every other day I have some colleague sharing with me or myself writing offers that are about 100,000 to 120,000 over asking. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the year plays out and what kind of increases we see in the housing market and prices over the next year because of this tight supply. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me through that. Next up, what you all came for, is we have Dan Hayes, the owner of Real Property Management Solutions, and he's going to dig into this new House Bill 4401 that was passed in December, give you some updates on the eviction moratorium, the landlord compensation fund, and really get into the regulatory stuff for you. Go ahead and take it away, Dan.
Thanks, Martine. I think you or Ben have to make me presenter.
Oh.
There we go. Thank you. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Martine, can you see that?
Just give me 1 second. Yes.
All right, perfect. Wait. All right, hopefully you guys can see that screen. Let me jump right in. So I'm here to talk about today. I think we'd be a little bit remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time talking about the impact of the pandemic on the rental market. Just like Martine is taking you through the significant impact on the selling market, let me take you through a few slides around the rental market. It's a dramatically different picture, which I think you'll agree when you see it here in a moment. I'm going to move through it pretty quickly because I want to get to that eviction moratorium detail, because I know that's what everybody's here to listen to. A couple of things before I begin. Please know, I am not giving you legal advice. Obviously, this is not intended to be legal advice. This particular topic is full of potential pitfalls, lots of complexity, and the penalties are pretty steep. So please make sure that if you find yourself in a sticky situation, or perhaps I'm not answering your question fully, please do what I do and seek legal advice. Can't stress it enough. I will share my sources with you. You may have looked at some research that show you a few different numbers. The rental industry is a little like that. I believe my information is accurate, but I don't guarantee it. And this is the word version of everything that I've said so far. All right, a little bit about us. All we do is property management. We don't have side business. We've got several years of property management experience. I'm an active real estate investor myself. I own several rental properties, all of which are managed by my company. We are a family-owned and operated business, and we go from single family to multifamily, all the way from Troutdale to Cornelius down into Newburgh. Everything with the Plex in its name, mid-market multifamily, as well as single family. Heck, we'll even manage an ADU if the situation is good. All right, here's what I'm going to talk about. As I said, I'll give you a quick run on the rental market update, how the pandemic has impacted our business. And I'll take that at a national level and drill down to the local level. I'll add a few of my thoughts on what the long-term implications are as a result of what we're seeing. I'll talk a little bit around rent collection and then into the meat of the eviction moratorium. All right, here's what the national pictures look like over the last year. Everything was going along just fine at the beginning of 2020. We were starting to see the normal uptick as we headed into the spring and the normal selling season. And then, of course, March 13th happened. Shelter-in-place orders were in effect. And that's when the decline in our national rent prices really started to accelerate. In fact, the majority of the rent decline that we saw nationally and in Portland, Oregon, occurred between March and June. Now, since June, we're starting to see the normal movement. As we all know, this rental business can be a little bit seasonality, have a little bit of seasonality to it, and we're starting to see that normal trajectory. Rent decline in the winter, starting to tick up now as we head into spring. So what gives? How can this possibly be? I mean, Martine just took you through how inventory is so low. Wouldn't that press rent prices up? In a normal situation, it would. But here's my hypothesis. Number one, when does a landlord normally take a rent increase? Usually at turnover, right? I'm a landlord. That's when I take my biggest rent increases if the market's moving or I've made improvement to the property. But when you disrupt that natural churn in our business, you really start to affect rent prices. Secondly, the next time a landlord raises the rent, if it's not a turnover, it's at lease renewal typically. Well, we landlords didn't know what was going to happen. We weren't quite sure what we were faced with. So we really held on to those tenants in a way that perhaps we hadn't up to that point. We were very, very careful with our rent increases, just doing everything we could to hold on to that tenancy, especially if that tenant was paying rent. And of course, in Portland, they did some things that really made it almost impossible to raise the rent. So that's what it looked like nationally. Here is some of the really big headline news. These pricey coastal superstar cities, they call them, or hub cities, gateway cities, they got hammered. In fact, San Francisco is still the most expensive market in the United States, down 27% for a 2-bedroom unit. Seattle, Boston, New York, all huge decreases year over year. We all know why. People started to move out of those cities, could work from home, and moved to more affordable cities, which is the top 10 that I show you here, led by Boise. Now, Boise's been hot for a while. In fact, Ben and I were talking about, Ben Ficker and I were talking about Boise about a year and a half ago, felt like we'd missed the boat. Well, Boise ranks at the top of rent growth since March. But there are other cities, Chesapeake, Fresno, Albuquerque, and so on. Now, here are a couple of things that I think are important for those of us that work with investors or maybe investors ourselves, where we may want to place our bets. I think it's going to be a while before these pricey cities do come back, but they will come back. Meanwhile, what we're starting to see is not a permanent shift into the suburbs. Martine's right. We're seeing pretty good absorption in those urban areas. The challenge on the rental side of things is there's a lot to absorb. There are a lot of units that have been delivered in those urban areas. So it's going to be a while because of that, and because it'll be a while before the whole work from home thing starts to settle out. But one of the trends that I think is a little bit permanent is the one that we're seeing where people know that they are going to be able to work from home for the long term, but may still need to get into the office from time to time. Think about cities that might be 90 minutes away from downtown Seattle, downtown San Francisco, heck, even in downtown Portland. Those cities, those adjacent cities, I call them, are really starting to see an uptick in demand on the rental side of things, because you can commute into the office with a 90-minute drive a couple of times a month, but you don't want to do that every single day. So we're starting to see some of those trends emerge. And as you think about where you might want to invest, might be something to consider. All right, let's take a look at the local picture. Very much the same thing. We saw rent prices in Portland decline significantly year over year, down 7% as we look at the year. Now, one of the things that's interesting about what's happening in Portland, we're starting to see that tick back up now. And we're anecdotally, I will tell you that is starting to happen. But it's a long way from being flat to prior year. Pretty big dip in Portland. A couple things that happened there. Of course, the natural churn that I talked about. But if you've been watching the permitting process of what's going on with permits, there was a land rush, I call it, to get permits issued and approved prior to the effective date of inclusionary zoning in Portland, where 20% of your units have to be affordable for 20 units or more. A huge amount of permits were issued prior to that taking effect. Since inclusionary zoning, massive drop off in permits. A lot of that inventory that was permitted prior to inclusionary zoning has been built and delivered. So we're seeing a lot of studio, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom units in Portland that are available to rent. Some of my units are close in. I certainly am feeling that impact. It's starting to move a little bit faster now, but we'll have to get those units absorbed before we see real progress there. What's happened out in the suburbs, think about what I showed you with that chart around pricey coastal cities, think Portland, and then those adjacent cities, take a look at this chart. Huge increase in Bend, up 10%. Huge increase in Salem and Eugene. Doesn't take that much to commute from Salem. Doesn't really take that much to get over the mountain. A little bit tough in the wintertime, I know, but it's not that bad to commute into Portland a couple of times a month from Bend. Heck, even Beaverton, Lake Oswego, Hillsborough, really pretty pricey cities, are largely flat or up slightly year over year compared to a down 7% in Portland. Okay, so is there a mad rush out of Portland? I don't think it's a mad rush, but there is certainly a movement out of Portland into the suburbs for a whole host of reasons. Okay, now this is straight fresh off the press from from Multifamily Northwest, the Northwest Apartment Investor Report. Take a look at this slide. Now going left to right, you can see what the spring 2020 vacancy rate was, what the spring 2021 vacancy rate was, how that changed, and then price per square foot and how that changed. Take a look at downtown Portland, Northwest Portland, inner and central, southeast and northeast. Huge vacancy rate increases. I mean, vacancy rate doesn't move very dramatically in the short term. This is a pretty big change. Take a look at that pricing, 8% downtown Portland. So that's been hammered. There are parts of Portland that are actually in pretty good shape. One of my projects is actually in North Portland. I'm really excited to get that thing delivered because you can see what's going on with pricing. Now, the vacancy rate of 10.8% in St. John's is the result of a really big complex being delivered, and that's being absorbed. It's actually better than it was last quarter's report, but you can see what's going on with pricing there. Where we see some pretty good increases is right where we talked about, Milwaukee, Oregon City, Beaverton, Hillsborough. Pretty good increases and really low vacancy rates. Okay, so that's what's happening. And when you think about where you may want to place your bets in the future, think about where this chart may be leading you, and think about how that might impact your decisions. So after this pandemic is done, here's what I think the long-term implications are. Number one, I think work from home in some capacity is here to stay. I know that's the master of the obvious a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be this black and white binary thing. I think there's going to be much more of a hybrid approach. Okay. The really big thing that's changed is, what do renters value most? At the top of the list is work from home space. I cannot tell you how quickly we can rent a home that has a very clear work from home space. In fact, this project that I have going on, I made some changes to the plans to create some of that space, and I think it's going to make a real difference. The other thing that's really changed is that outdoor space where people can get away from it all at the end of the day. Huge value. And then finally, Anything you can do to keep from pushing your residents out of that unit and out into the public is going to benefit you, whether that's in-unit washers and dryers, anything that you might think about, storage, other things. And then your pet policy. I'm working on my next presentation is around pets, pet policies, pet ownership, and here's what I'll tell you. 67% of the households in the US report having a pet. That's according to a 2017 survey. Depending on which research you look at, the pandemic drove pet ownership up anywhere between 15 and 20%. Bottom line is everybody has a pet. So a strict no pet policy, probably not going to serve you well. All right. So don't give up on urban areas just yet. Take a look at your policies. Think about how you can help people stay in their units. All right. Let's jump into the moratorium update. If you have questions, throw those in the question area, as Martine said, and we'll do our best to answer those. What we really have to start with when it comes to this moratorium update is, what are we dealing with? There's really 5 things that we've had thrown at us. They're pretty substantial. Number 4 and 5 really are just about out of the way. In other words, Portland's relocation assistance requirement for any rent increase was actually for any rent effective to March 31st. I've heard some folks, even an attorney, who thinks that that's been extended. I can tell you it hasn't. So any rent increase that a landlord issued to a tenant after October 13th, and it was effective before March 31st, and the tenant requested a relocation payment, you're liable, you have responsibility to pay that. We are just a few days away from that being over. Multnomah County had their own eviction moratorium. If you recall, it extended the eviction moratorium until June 30th, but gave tenants a grace period that began July 1 and ended in February of 2022. Now in January, Multnomah County and the city of Portland followed and suspended that ordinance to align with House Bill 4401. The reason why is because you couldn't actually access the landlord compensation fund if you followed Multnomah County's eviction moratorium, because it didn't require a declaration form, which I'll talk about in a minute. So those 2 things are out the door. Don't worry too much about those. If you have anybody tell you those are in place, make sure you confirm that, because I'll tell you they aren't. Now, Hillsborough had an eviction moratorium. That's over with. Don't worry about that. It was pretty minor. It was actually not very effective. We weren't impacted by it at all, but that was out there. Don't worry about that. What you really need to know about now is the CDC eviction moratorium. That is in place until March 31st. That was extended. The CDC moratorium is unique in that it does require that the tenant submit a form under the penalty of perjury. So it's a little bit more difficult to submit a form than perhaps the declaration form in Portland, or in Oregon, which I'll talk about. But that CDC moratorium is in place. Now, I've just recently read that it's pretty likely that the CDC will extend that moratorium into July. The $1.9 trillion Biden proposal actually originally had the eviction moratorium at the CDC level extended until September. It's my understanding that's not the case, but do expect the CDC moratorium to extend into July. It won't be a big deal for us because it will keep language, I believe, whereby it says that if a local government has stronger tenant protection, then the CDC moratorium will not apply. It will be the local moratorium that applies. And sure enough, House Bill 4401 provides much stronger tenant protection than the CDC one does. So we really are going to have to watch the CDC, but I think House Bill 4401 will prevail all the way through. Now, a couple things on the legislative front that you should know about. We're members of Rental Housing Alliance of Oregon. I attended the member meeting this month. Ron Garcia has been working with the state, and he believes, and I agree with Ron, that the eviction moratorium that is set to expire on June 30th will not be extended, but the grace period to pay back any balance owing will be extended, and we expect it to be extended to February of 2022. And the logic is that there's a lot more money coming from that $1.9 trillion package. It's just going to take a while to get here, and they want to give folks a chance to access that rather than be evicted. So expect the eviction moratorium, and again, anything can happen, but do expect the eviction moratorium, at least the ability for a landlord to end the tenancy for non-payment rent, that should end on July 1, but the grace period will most likely be extended. So how does this all work? Well, remember, House Bill 4213 started in April 1st. That's when it began. And it just established a couple of big things. It established an emergency period, and that emergency period said you can't evict for non-payment of rent. You can't issue a no-cause notice to vacate. You can't charge a late fee, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that was set to expire at the end of September. House Bill 4401 picked that up and extended that emergency period eviction moratorium to December 31st. It then established a grace period, the period of time that a tenant could pay back the non-payment balance that occurred between April 1 and December 31st. That grace period went to March 31st. As I said, the CDC moratorium extended to March 31st. Now, here's the thing that House Bill 4401 did. It added an element that allowed for a tenant to submit to the landlord a declaration form. And this declaration form does not carry the penalty of perjury. It's very easy to do, and I'll show you some of the requirements in a moment. But once a tenant submits a declaration form to the landlord, everything that I said about the emergency period and the grace period, that just gets moved to July 1. So if you've received a declaration form, that emergency period and currently the grace period is extended to June 30th, 2021. All right. Let's talk about some of the details here. Really, when you think about the eviction moratorium and the complexity that's associated with it, I like to break things down in its most simple form. And for me, it comes down to the first filter. Have I received a declaration form or have I not received a declaration form? If I've not received a declaration form from the tenant, then that emergency period, the period of time that I cannot evict for non-payment rent, ended on December 31st, and I'm a few days away from the end of the grace period. If I have received a declaration form, then all of that gets extended to June 30th. Okay, so that's really the first thing. Have you received a declaration form from your tenant? Now, this means the declaration form in substantially the same form that's in the bill, but you cannot restrict the way in which they give it to you. In writing, a picture, a text, an email, essentially really any way that they can get that to you, you have to accept that. So that's filter one. Declaration form, yes. Declaration form, no. Now, the way it works is you are absolutely prevented from terminating a tenancy for no cause until July 1, declaration form or not. If you've received a declaration form, what I've told you applies. The one thing I want you to know is the tenant submitting the declaration form is not the only way that you can extend this moratorium or trigger an extension. You as a landlord, based on your actions, could trigger an extension. Here's how that would work. If you're like us and you are giving your tenants a balance reminder that they owe you rent and that they can't be evicted for that non-payment of rent, if you do that, you must include two additional pieces of documentation in that notice. One is what's called House Bill 4401 notice. It's right in the bill, but it just basically says all the things that the tenant has a right to as part of House Bill 4401. The second thing that has to be in there is the actual declaration form itself. And the language in the bill says that the landlord must provide that form in substantially the same format that's in the bill. Here's the headline. Go get yourself a really good form from a resource like Multifamily Northwest or Rental Housing Alliance. But if you're doing a balance reminder, and really literally anything that says, hey, Martine, you owe me rent from December. If I don't have that notice and the declaration form in that communication, I just triggered an extension of the eviction moratorium period and the grace period. If you do that for a termination notice, we have tenants who did not pay in January, did not pay in February, or perhaps didn't pay in March. They have not submitted a declaration form. officially their emergency period is over. Okay, we sent some end of tenancy notices. One of three things happened. They either called us and said, let's get on a payment plan, or they paid rent, or the second thing that happened, you probably guessed it, they gave us a declaration form. The third is some haven't said anything, and we're actually going to go through the eviction process, fully expecting that at some point in time in that process, we'll get a declaration form. And if we do, we'll have to stop, and all of it gets extended to June 30th. You can also extend it if you don't add this information to your eviction summons, okay? So just know that you can trigger that based on what you do. Because it's so complicated, you may consider just not dealing with any of that and just operate as if the emergency period goes to June 30th, declaration form or not. Imagine a property management firm like ours with 1,000 units trying to keep all that straight. Well, we have to, because we owe our clients a fiduciary responsibility, okay? But you may have one or more units, maybe it's too much, too risky, that's okay. It's not that difficult to submit a declaration form. So consider perhaps just behaving and acting according to the eviction moratorium being extended to June 30th, okay? Now, as a bit of a scorecard or placard, if you will, this when can I do whatever, here's the big bucket list of activities. First, if you want to end the tenancy for no cause, in other words, they haven't lived in the property for a year, they're on month to month, and you want to end it, you cannot do that, okay? You cannot do that between now and June 30th. But here's the thing. In the bill, it says that if the occupancy year, the year of occupancy date falls during the emergency period, that occupancy period will be extended to a month beyond the emergency period, which is a fancy way of saying that, let's say I rent to Martine, April 1st, her 1 year occupancy is up and she's on month to month. I can enter a tenancy, but I have to wait until July 1. Okay, so they've extended that 1 year lease. If that's confusing to you, get some help, but just know that you can still end the tenancy without cause. You just can't do it until July 1. You can end a tenancy for lease violations that aren't non-payment related. In fact, I've talked to a number of people that think they can enforce their lease. You can and should enforce your lease, because you can end the tenancy for cause, unpermitted pet, unpermitted occupants, major lease violations, just as long as you're not ending the tenancy for anything rent payment related. If you want to implement one of the 4 landlord qualifying reasons that's in 90.427, 5A through D, or 5.8A through D, you can. Moving back in, accepted offer, demolishing, converting use, repair, renovations, you can do that now. Now there are a bunch of rules, as we know: documentation, 90-day notice, relocation, perhaps depending on where it's at or how many units you have. But just know you can end the tenancy for one of those landlord qualifying reasons. The rest of it, basically, it's do you have a declaration form, yes or no? And if you do, you're extended to July 1. So you can charge late fees now if you don't have a declaration form. Okay, you can terminate for no 90.427. You can terminate for non-payment of rent during the current period. You can terminate for non-payment balance starting April 1. So in other words, one of the tenants that I have hasn't paid since April. They owe me about $27,000. Assume I don't have a declaration form. I can terminate for non-payment balance starting April 1. Okay, for that debt that is due on between April 1 to December 31st. Okay, you cannot report that non-payment balance to a credit agency until April 1. If they've submitted a declaration form, it's July, and then any other action to collect that non-payment balance, again, April 1 or July 1. Now, this whole declaration form, as well as the landlord compensation fund, if you've not been going through it, I will tell you it's not awesome. Okay, I will give the state low marks for the way in which they've rolled out the landlord compensation fund. And I'm not trying to be overly critical, but I've experienced it firsthand, both as somebody who is part of the property management firm, but also as a landlord. But here's how it will work. Number one, they're going to chunk out the money. So the first tranche was $50 million. It's now closed, okay? The next tranche will begin in April. But basically what has to happen is you have to have a declaration form from the tenant. Once you have that, now you can initiate the application. You have to provide notice to the tenants that have past due rent with a notice of the opportunity that they have to have their past due rent covered. So in other words, if you're going to apply for that landlord compensation fund, you need to send a notice to the tenants that says, hey, your landlord's going to do something that might have your past due rent covered. It's called a building notice, okay? So that tenant that I talked about, I am going to submit for the landlord compensation fund and have. First thing I did after receiving the declaration form, sent them the building notice that said, hey, your past due rent may be forgiven. You then go and create an account online and begin the process. Be prepared to provide a W-9 for ownership verification. If you want your money electronic, you're going to have ACH information. You're going to need to provide tenant data, which is a template called a rent roll template. It's pretty complicated, but you have to list all of your units, all of the months of rent that you would charge, and whatever you collected each month, so that they can see, here's what the landlord should have received, here's what the landlord actually received, so they can prioritize where the money goes. You're also going to have to be willing to forgive 20% of that debt, okay? Because they're going to ask you, how much are you looking for? The reason they're asking you how much they're looking for is perhaps you received a little bit of that money since then. But whatever you ask for, it's got to be 20% of what less than what you've actually are owed, because you have to be willing to forgive that 20%. And there's a few other bits of information that you need to provide. You upload your declaration forms, submit that, verify 8 separate things, and your application will be received. Again, it has not worked well. Documents not uploading, system freezing, all kinds of issues. They're working hard to get it right, but it's not there yet. Okay. Now, there are a number of resources here, and I believe Martine will provide this presentation out to the attendees. But when you do, here are some helpful links. There's actually a process video for the full application. There are instructions for the application. There's a rent roll template and a video on how to fill out the rent roll, and of course the program web page. I've provided the helpline a little bit of feedback, and my bit of feedback was, you know, if you have a video that's 15 minutes long to explain how the application works, you might have overcomplicated the application process, but that's in fact what's happened. So hopefully you'll find these links helpful. And then lastly, just know it's pretty painful monetarily if you make a mistake, so make sure you're right or get help. There's an injunctive relief on the eviction if you make a mistake, and you're going to pay attorney fees unless you could prove that you didn't know they submitted a declaration form. And if you do, you have to stop what you're doing. How rents paid has changed for anything that's been paid out during the emergency period. Be aware of that. Make sure you consult legal counsel before you do any termination notice. You can use security deposits to pay down the non-payment balance. Remember also that you have to your collection efforts should cease until any grace period is expired, even for previous tenants. If you're going to end the tenancy for non-payment of rent, it's not the 3-day pay or quit. Now, during the emergency period, it's actually 10-day pay or quit. Make sure you don't make a mistake there. And then again, we're not quite sure how that whole LCF is going to be on our clients' ledgers, etc. But we are going to get through it. We are starting to see actually some light at the end of the tunnel. We collected almost 5.5% of the rent in March so far. And the fact that we did some of those 10-day notices to pay or quit actually made a pretty big difference. So hopefully you found that helpful. Again, if you have some questions, throw those in the questions section. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to change presenter. I have to talk my way through that. Now back to you, Martine. Maybe I'm mute, Martine. I cannot hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to switch over and start sharing my screen, hopefully. Sorry, guys. Just give me 1 second.
Martine, you are already sharing your screen. It's
Oh,
just
I am?
showing
Okay.
but it's not showing the slides.
Okay, give me just a second. I'm trying to get my mouse over. Oh, here we go. Okay, can you see the slides? Are you seeing which slides are you seeing? The presentation, or are you seeing my full screen with notes?
Overcoming challenges to selling tenant-occupied properties is the slide that we see.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Okay, so at this point, we've gone over some overall market dynamics. So we've gone over some overall market dynamics, regulatory effects on the rental market, which Dan Hayes, that was awesome. He did mention Ben Ficker, who just popped in. He is our our multifamily specialist who we work in partnership with. So I handle residential properties. Ben handles multifamily brokerage sales, and Dan takes care of those tenants and manages, just to give you guys an overall of who you're hearing from. So some of you may be looking for at this opportunity in the market with such strong prices that you might also want to take advantage of. And we're going to go over some of the nuances of selling a tenant property, a tenant occupied property, and some strategies. So we're going to talk, just as an overview, we're going to talk about prepping, marketing, and closing tenant occupied properties, getting ready for the sale, prepping your tenants and your property. So, big and the most important part is you have to communicate with your tenants. Sometimes that can be difficult, but we want to make sure you do that. Budgeting for costs for tenants to vacate potentially, and knowing the schedule, due to that 90-day notice, that can be something that we want to pay attention to. We want to talk a little bit about marketing with a tenant occupied listing and what it looks like to have a listing live and showing with tenants in place, and then accepting an offer and closing and those timelines. So some potential strategies that you could use. So we have option one, maybe not sell. Maybe you don't have the option to sell. This might not be right for you with the tenants in place. The second option would be to execute an interior inspection upon acceptance, an accepted offer, which can be difficult. The way that we put that language in our marketing is subject to interior inspection. A lot of times, depending on the agent, they can't properly explain what that is to a potential buyer, especially if we're looking at a residential buyer. If we're looking at a buyer that's a investor, they are well versed in subject to interior inspection. That's what they have to do when you look at a multi-family property typically. Our third option would be to post a 24-hour notice to enter. This is an option people do use, although it can be very problematic. There's a lot of pitfalls and might not be the best option to keep your tenants happy. And then fourth option would be to execute a permission to show. Sorry, this can be the best option for you and the tenant, and that's just because you basically have a plan in place to show, and it's all documented. And you heard Dan say plenty of times that documentation is very important in this process. And we just want to note that nobody cares that you want to sell. Really, it's just doing it in the right order and really working with those tenants. So let's get into this. Well, prepping the property. So I've said communicating with the tenants. You want to tell your tenants that you're selling the property, and that might be one of those hurdles that it's hard to end a tenancy or burden the tenants with selling, but you got to do what's best for you. So you want to communicate that. You may, depending on the situation, ask the tenants if they want to buy the property. And in some cases, tenants don't necessarily always communicate that they're looking to buy. So especially with, the stimulus that's come out, and, we're not eating out and people aren't traveling. So there's a lot of money that, that the excess money that we would be spending on those things that they've saved up and potentially want to get into a property. So that might be an easy way to get that property sold and not have to go on the market. You want to budget for costs for the vacating tenants. So one of our favorite options, and this is one of the options that we always want to talk about with a potential seller, is to talk to the clients or to the tenants and offer them cash for keys. And what that looks like is you come up with an amount within your budget and you offer that to the tenants to vacate the property prior to the 90-day notice. It's really just them agreeing, yeah, you know what, we're happy to take a lump sum of money. They're tenants. Sometimes that really works out for them. It's a win-win for you to have that property vacant, because having a property vacant is the best way to sell a house in this market, because it gives everybody, any buyers that are interested, the opportunity to walk through the house, and you don't have to manage how the tenants keep the house, because sometimes that can be a problem. So cash for keys would be one of our favorite ways to go. And then, depending on what county and what's currently overlaying, there may still be relocation fees. And if you have any questions on relocation fees, I know Dan is absolutely available for people that want to talk about the nuts and bolts of tenant occupancy and tenant landlord stuff. And then you want to know your schedule. So if you do have a tenant that does stay in place and doesn't want to buy the house, there's a couple of things that we can negotiate within the sale. So usually when you finally get an offer accepted, and we will talk about marketing and showing, but say, let's jump to you have an accepted offer. What you have to do is then serve a 90-day notice to those tenants. Why that matters is, depending on the buyer, you may have a owner-occupied buyer, and what for them in a typical sale, they will have financing. So you're looking at that first 30 days of the 90 days that's going to take up just the financing and getting the property closed. Now, depending on that buyer, they may not want to take on the tenants, which that's that last 60 days. So in that case, we would negotiate a 90-day closing. If it's a buyer that's an investor, that 30 days works perfect. And then if you have somebody that decides to buy cash, that 30 days can be put down to about 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how they're getting their cash. So really just knowing that schedule and serving the tenant with that schedule and over communicating, I think really keeps everybody aligned and happy along the way. Okay, so we're going to move from prepping to marketing. So some of the tactics or strategies that we use to sell tenant occupied properties is a 3D walkthrough. So I'm sure some of you have been online and you can move your cursor around the house and really get a feel for layout, where closets are, and things that you wouldn't normally see in a photo. So that is a really great way to eliminate too many entries for those for the tenants. So it kind of, I guess, funnels down the people that are actually going to go into the house. And especially if you have a situation where the tenants are really wanting it subject to interior inspection, that's going to be the best option. Another strategy for marketing that really keeps the deal together once we're in contract is a pre-inspection. Now, this used to not be a very popular strategy, but it's something that we're seeing more and more of. I know that, when I work with Ben on multifamily, he does this quite often because it really gives you the chance of no surprises. You know what you're dealing with, and so does the other party. So in this market, what we're seeing on single family houses is that people get really excited and they're having to compete with sometimes, I want to say the big one was 120 offers on a home in Gresham just this last week, but they're typically, competing against 10, 15 other offers. So in that, you do get people that will put their price way up, they get into contract and they jump right out, or they see the inspection and they jump right out. So having that pre-inspection really kind of tightens up and reduces the risk of going back on the market. And we really don't want to go back on the market, because in a typical market, and typically we will see the price come down, because now in the mind of the buyers that are out there, something's wrong with your property, even though nothing may be wrong with your property. It's just that, buyer got cold feet. And in this market, we're seeing about 25% of homes come back on the market because of the frenzy that they're having to deal with. Okay, now let's move into listing and showing with tenants in place. So like I said, with the options, we do have the option to advertise that it's subject to interior inspection. That's an option. It's not our favorite option, because it is really hard for a first-time home buyer or just a residential buyer to comprehend that they can't physically get into the property. So in those instances, we can show with the data that you don't get as much money or top price when they're not able to get into the property. In this market, I mean, we are still seeing amazing offers over asking in that subject to interior inspection, but it's just a little bit harder when you're doing it that way. One of our favorite options is if you know the tenants and we know their personality and you feel comfortable, they may let you, you can offer them a weekend away. So you can send them off to Bend or send them out to the coast for the weekend so that we can show for 2 days and allow them not to be bombarded by people coming and going and all the scheduling around it. My last listing, we went ahead and did cash for keys. They decided to go out, move out of the home within 30 days, which was really wonderful. It was a bonus for them because they got a big chunk of money. And for the seller, we were able to market it without any hassle regarding the tenants. And I will say, when you have 45 showings in 2 days, you really want that house to be vacated. So if your tenants are willing to work with you and you can provide them a weekend away, I think that, for many tenants that might not be even an option financially. So that gift can be a big help for both of you and create that win-win situation. Say they don't want to go away, or it's not in your budget to pay cash for keys or pay a weekend away, right? Because not all of us are in the same situation. We then want to work with a tenant to, second best or the better option than subject to interior inspection would be to work with them to allow either a day of an open house where we have a agent in place, so they're watching their stuff and they're physically there, and let folks come and go during that window. Sorry, got kids in the house. And then so we want to do that open house. So we're really trying to maximize the amount of people getting into your property. I always tell people the magic happens when they physically can get there. Second best option would be that 3D walkthrough. And really, before you get to any of the stuff, when you give the tenants notice, you want to be able to outline this and work with your agent on, when are pictures going to happen? When is the 3D walkthrough going to happen? When is pre-inspections going to happen? And you give them that communication and over communicate with them as they go through the process, because it's a cumbersome process. It's definitely going to interrupt their lives, and we really want them to be happy on the way out. They're having to move. It's not an ideal situation. All right, so closing. So once you get an accepted offer, depending on the buyer. So in this case, let's say the buyer is going to occupy the property. Once you get that offer, you have 90, or you want to serve them a 90-day notice. So your accepted offer, it's executed, then you give the buyer a 90-day notice and potentially pay whatever relocation fees are an overlay in your county or at the time, right? Because that could be today, it could be in 2 months, and things are changing. With that 90 days, like I said before, it's really important to negotiate the best terms for yourself. So if it is, and in this market, you can. Buyers are willing to do a lot to get into a property, because you saw we have 1 month of inventory and people are offering 100,000 over asking. So they will take tenants. It's not our favorite way. It's not their favorite way, but we can negotiate those. So before we get to this point, we would go over, if we were working with you, what's your ideal situation, and what's the place that you'll go to before you want somebody to walk away, right? So if we do that 90 days, is that buyer going to take on the tenant for 60 days and then have them move out, or are we going to do a 90-day closing? And if you're working with a different realtor, one of the things I will say is you want them to talk to the buyer's lender. If it's cash, that's one piece. But if you're taught with a lender, can they do that 90-day close? Some lenders cannot. So you want that conversation to happen prior to accepting an offer. And then again, we're going to hit that communication as hard as we can. Tenants are people too, and the more information that we have, the better we feel. So we want to give them a transaction timeline, and that's going to outline when the property needs to be accessed. And you're going to be serving 24-hour notices for inspections, for contractors to come in if you need to have that, and obviously keep communicating with your tenants and have that 90-day or have that timeline available. If you're lucky, you get a investor offer, and then you're gonna, depending on what they, you're not going to serve that 90-day notice, and you're going to be able to close within that investor's timeline. So whether it's cash, which is usually about 2 weeks to 4 weeks, or it's a loan, which is typically about 4 weeks, sometimes hitting 5, just depending on the lender. And then you'd close. And so with the buyer occupied, with a investor, you're just going to close. You're going to switch over keys, give them any information that you have. I know Dan touched on rent rolls, any kind of documentation, leases, that kind of thing. You're going to give over to a investor. With a buyer that's going to occupy, depending on what you negotiate, that closing is going to happen within 2 weeks to 90 days. And then you're got all your profits and could move on to doing maybe a 1031 exchange or some other fund. With all that said, we've hit our questions and answer section. I don't see any questions in the box. Ben, did you see any questions pop up?
Yeah, I cleared them out, but there was a handful of questions that revolved around the same few things. And I made the notes here. 1 second. The first question was, how long is it taking to sell a house in this market? How long does it take to get the house under contract?
So depending on, if you were able to get your tenants to agree to cash for keys, I just recently did this. We talked to the tenants in mid-January, and they were out by February 1st. We were able to get the house on the market. She had to do some prepping. She painted and did some things, but we were able to get the house on the market within 10 days, and it was pending in 4, only because we decided to wait 4 days. We received 3 offers in the first 12 hours. So depending on your timeline and what you want to do with your real estate agent, it could be 24 hours that your home is under contract. And then again, depending on the financing options, you could be closed between 2 weeks and 90 days.
Got it. This question popped up in a handful of times, although you just went over it, but just to reiterate, can I get a tenant out of the house before selling?
Yes. I find that tenants are really excited when they're going to get a large chunk of money. So in the example that I just gave, these tenants, she offered them $5,500, or no, $5,000 to move out, and they were like, we'll be out in 30 days. I think for most people, if it was me and I didn't have a, I could find something to move into, and like Dan said, there's inventory, and they might get a better rate right now than they're currently paying. I would take $5,000. I mean, most people aren't making that in a month or, in 30 days. So I think we're seeing a lot of people really willing to do that. And that's going to be the easiest and best way to get you the highest and most money for your property.
Just a couple of things, and I completely agree with Martine. I'm not arguing the point at all, but a couple of things that I've seen over the last several months. Cash for keys means just that, cash for the keys. Don't give the cash before you get the keys. I've seen some mistakes there. Secondly, if you're in Portland, Oregon, you don't do this right, you could be subject to a relocation payment in addition to the cash for keys, even when you try and lump them together. So if you are going to do a cash for keys, I would highly recommend that part of the agreement is that the tenants and the tenancy with the landlord in writing. Because if you as a landlord and the tenancy, you will pay a relocation payment in Portland, Oregon, and it could make for a pretty tough legal situation if you don't do that right. So highly recommend, and hopefully Martine agrees with that you have the tenants and the tenancy with the landlord, and then they get the cash when they give the keys.
Right. And I'll add to that with the example that I'm just giving. We worked with their property management company to end the tenancy, gave them all the information, gave them options to buy. We gave them everything and let them make the decision on what they wanted to do, whether they wanted to stay in place, whether they wanted the cash for keys or relocation and that kind of thing. So absolutely, if you're going to do this and you're not with a property management company, please talk to a lawyer, give Dan a call, and figure it out. You do not want to pay that double and cut into your profits.
And when you think about how much, there is a reference point with the relocation requirement. So if the tenants didn't do anything and you ended the tenancy after you accept an offer from a buyer, they're going to get $4,500. Don't kid yourself and think you're going to get away with $1,000 to get cash for keys, right? They have this reference point, and if you get challenged, it may look like you are trying to take advantage. So just some things to think about there based on my experience.
Real quick to add on to that, Dan, in Portland, can you run over the relocation amounts, and then outside of Portland, the relocation amounts?
Yeah, so in Portland, Oregon, doesn't matter how many units you own, one or more. It's $2,900 for a studio, up to $4,500 for a 3-bedroom or more. If it's outside of Portland, it's $0 for 4 or less units. If you own more than 4 anywhere, either full or partial, it's an amount equal to 1 month's rent. When that is due is different in Portland than it is outside of Portland. In outside of Portland, it's due when you serve the notice. Excuse me, yeah, outside of Portland, it's when you serve the notice. If it's in Portland, it's 45 days from the end of the tenancy. And there are a whole bunch of other rules there. So just hire someone like Martine and get an attorney, and you'll be okay.
Right. Thank you for adding in, Dan. I think that's really important. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, I just want to add in a little piece from, so I do the multifamily stuff. Martine nails it on the single family. I'm sure, Martine, you get the same questions. Everybody wants to know, what should I do to get my property ready to sell? And they're thinking about fresh paint or landscaping or whatever. And if they've got tenants in place, I tell them the best investment you can make is that cash for keys, because having more people through the door will lead to a higher sales price, much more than putting granite countertops in over your old Formica, right? Just think of it as an investment to sell your property for top dollar, not I'm giving money away to my tenants.
Right. I agree. I totally agree. Having I mean, just from the buyer's perspective, right? Because I do about 50-50. Buyers want to get into houses. They have a very difficult time if they're going to be occupying that home. They are not used to making an offer that is subject to interior inspection. And it is very hard to walk through a tenant occupied property that is you know, I mean, there's lots of different people. We live lots of different ways, and you really want your property to not have a bunch of other people's stuff up. So I find that it's just an easier conversation with buyers when the property's vacant. And I think you're absolutely right. It's an investment to have it vacant versus not getting enough buyers in there. And especially in this market, the amount of people getting in there matters, because the more offers you get, the higher the price goes.
I think we've got one last question here, unless anybody else wants to throw anything in. But this is from Kenny. It says 30-day verbal. Kenny, I assume that means that they're going to vacate in 30 days or something. But please clarify if that's not correct. It says they've got up to 4 dogs now, received hardship notices, but her dogs keep ruining the recently furnished floors. Yard work's done, dogs dig holes. She always says it's not convenient for 24-hour notice. There's not really a question mark in there, but I think, Dan, what you might want to touch on is enforcing the rent or enforcing the lease if there's damage on getting that person out.
Yeah, Ben, you knew exactly where we would go with that. When you say hardship notice, I'm assuming you've received a declaration notice is what you mean by that. Essentially, what you want to make sure you are aware of is when a landlord knows that a lease violation has occurred, which if you've got the proper lease, proper addendum for the pets, that language should include the necessary language that this damage is a lease violation. If you've not issued a lease violation as an enforcement to the lease and followed up as to whether it's been cured or not, and you continue to collect rent, you give up your ability to evict for that lease violation. So it really depends on, have you enforced your lease the right way, and have you or could you have collected rent with that lease enforcement in place, right? So if a landlord continues to collect rent knowing that a lease violation has occurred and they don't enforce that lease, they largely give up their ability to evict for that lease violation.
All right, that is it on questions. Go ahead and wrap it up.
Thanks very much for the opportunity, Martine. Great job.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us today. We are going to send out Dan's presentation. If you're looking for a property manager, best in the business, you got Dan Hayes. And if you're thinking about selling, let's have a conversation and see what we can do for you. Have a great night, guys.